Good morning to everybody, and I believe that some of you are far-flung places. I've been hearing all about you. Uh, the time is 7:15 in very hot England, and today's subject in itself is very hot with an intriguing title, which is today we go back to America, and it's entitled A Bottle of Coca-Cola and a Lynching, and we shall see how they connect with each other as we move through. Now, German Jews were in the 19th century. There were about a half a million Jews in Germany, and at the time of American independence, they were around that number, and they were never more than 1%. The whole story of German Jewry at all times is never more than 1% of the population. And even when Jews reached their maximum number in around the year 1910, where they were now around 615,000, even then, the actual percentage of Jews in Germany declined for a variety of different reasons, essentially because the German population was increasing faster than the Jewish population. Now, the Jews were declining for a variety of reasons. One of them, they had a low birth rate, there was intermarriage, there was late marriage, 10% conversion, and emigration. Now, before the subject which we had already dealt with, which was when we were dealing with the emigration to America from Eastern Europe, we are here going to be touching on the subject of German emigration to America prior to the move of Eastern European Jews in their particular period. Now, our period of the 19th century, around 70 to 80,000, although some say 100,000 Jews, mainly men, young men, went to the United States. And it was in the interest, actually, of Hapag, Hapag, or the Hamburg America line, which was the line which took the emigrants from the ports of Germany all the way to America. It was in their interest, in fact, to take as many Jews as they could. It was part of their business. The business, in fact, was run by somebody Jewish, Albert Balin, who you could read about, and he carried them to America. Now, when the German Jews got to America, many, or some, did in fact settle off in New York. But but this is a period of time in America when they actually were welcoming immigrants. They needed people to populate this vast land. And in this country, there were civil liberties, and they would, the Jews themselves, also fight for independence, which we are celebrating this very moment, as it were, of 1776, the Declaration of Independence. By the late 18th century, Jews were moving southward. The German Jews who had emigrated were moving southward, and they went along the eastern coast, for instance, the period that, or the area that we're dealing with. They went along the eastern border of America, and they traveled from Boston and New York, through New York, to Philadelphia, Richmond, Charleston, Savannah, and Atlanta. And Atlanta would become one of those places where it was popular for people to go. Now, Atlanta was named, it had a previous name, it was only named in 1845, and the Jewish community that was there was essentially German Jewish immigrants. They threw themselves into being successful. They threw themselves into being American. They threw themselves into being educated. And they became successful in what they did, especially in the area of the retail industry. Now, there was no community as such. There were merely a collection of Jews until about 1860, something called the Temple, which became the center of Jewish life in Atlanta. Then, with the German Jews who had moved there, they felt assimilated, reformed. They would join a reform community. They integrated, and they felt at home and successful, and thought there was, and believed there was, no anti-Semitism because of their success. Then, at that point, later in the 19th century, along came Eastern European Jews, Ostjuden. They were unassimilated. Yiddish-speaking poor, and to the German Jews who had settled in Atlanta, they were simply and, quote, an embarrassment. The Orthodox at that time required a rabbi, and along came someone you probably never heard of, and few have, but he was the rabbi of Atlanta for some 60 years, and he was a Rabbi Tobias Geffen, or Tuvia Geffen, and he was born in Kaunas, or in Kovno, and he was a product of the famous Slobodka Yeshiva, which is a suburb of Kovno. And he was therefore a product of one of the most famous yeshivas in the world at that time. It was in fact known as the mother of yeshivas. And he integrated the teachings also of what was part of the yeshiva movement there of Mussar, of doing the right thing in the right way. In 1903, he moved to America. And on health advice, because his breathing wasn't too good and his chest wasn't wonderful and his lungs weren't as they could be, his medical people advised that he should move south. And he moved south and settled in Atlanta. And there in Atlanta, he became, as I said, the community rabbi for some 60 years in the She'erit Yisrael community. And he was the steward. He was the center of that city in Atlanta and that region of South America, of North America, for over 60 years. And he was the one who was fanatical, not fanatical, he was punctilious in the observance of Jewish halakha, and he felt the lack of religious schools, and he was also keen on the observance of kashrut, of kosher. Now, being the outstanding rabbi, this particular Rabbi Geffen here, he was, being the outstanding rabbi of the southern states of America, he received, as rabbi did through all time, he received a numerous amount of correspondence on all different issues, especially kashrut. There, many a time he noted, he was receiving letter after letter after letter, believe it or not, on the issue of Coca-Cola. I do apologize. On the issue of Coca-Cola. And their receiving was on the fact that Coca-Cola was not accepted necessarily as being kosher. And he was asked in all these different letters come from different places, well, is this Coca-Cola kosher? Now, Coca-Cola was invented in Atlanta from type of soda drink with certain ingredients which made it that which we know and love today. And in those days, it was in these glass bottles. And it was bottled as such from 1891. And Coca-Cola, as we know, and it is to today, became a symbol of America. It was iconic. But was it kosher? And not only that, was it kosher on Passover? So there were two issues that Rabbi Geffen was faced with. In 1935, Rabbi Geffen received permission to view the secret formula. He was actually given the ability to see the secret formula, which is, as we know, secret, and was able to assess whether it was kosher. And it seemed to include within the Coca-Cola formula, there were not the amounts, he didn't know the amounts, but he knew the formula, was a beef-based glycerin, beef tallow. Seeing this, because it was added in and wasn't there by mistake, he described it as being not kosher. Procter and Gamble were approached, and therefore they replaced that ingredient with a cotton-based, oil-based glycerin, and it became therefore kosher for general use as a result of Rabbi Geffen getting the beef-based glycerin removed, even though it was only 1 in 1,000 parts from this drink known as Coca-Cola in the mid-19th, end of the 19th century. But still he was faced with, is it kosher on Passover? Because part of its byproduct, he noticed, was a grain which was in it, also in minute amounts, and it was what we would call in the Ashkenaz world kitniot, something which is a product of grain and therefore unacceptable on Passover. Coca-Cola chemists actually apply themselves again for Rabbi Geffen's approach in order that they could improve the situation and have it acceptable for Jews. And they replaced this grain by cane and beet sugars, something which could be added in, which did, most importantly, did not change the taste of Coca-Cola. And every year, the Coca-Cola company would do what they called a Passover run. And if you went to America, you'd see today they have yellow tops on the Coca-Cola. Said Rabbi Geffen, is teshuvah in his response concerning Coca-Cola, with the help of God, I've been able to uncover a pragmatic solution according to which there could be no question nor any doubt concerning the ingredients of Coca-Cola. It is now possible for the most stringent halachic individual to enjoy Coca-Cola throughout the year and on Passover. And therefore, as a result of this rabbi, Coca-Cola became acceptable to be drunk for the whole Jewish, Orthodox Jewish world at that time and onwards to today. But decades later, Rabbi Geffen was, or decades before, was involved in an issue which was greater than Coca-Cola, where matters were not of a little bit of beef or a spot of grain, but they were life and death issues in that same city of Atlanta. And Rabbi Geffen would visit the individual that would become famous because of the accusations. There was a family, the Frank family. They were of New York, and they had a young son, Leo Frank. He was a privileged, he would describe himself as a privileged youngster. He looked a privileged youngster, he dressed as a privileged youngster, and he attended Cornell University in 1906. The family moved to Atlanta in 1908, and Leo became the president, even at his young age, of the Atlanta chapter of B'nai B'rit. The Jews lived in calm and peaceful lives. Many were influential, many were affluent, many were professional, lawyers, doctors, dentists, and other such things, and they felt safe and secure as any Jews could feel at that time in this wonderful land of America. Maybe, some would say, the Jews were a little too complacent. They lived in a bubble, and they were not acknowledging the reality of the economic situation down south in America, and especially around Atlanta at that time, of economic depression in the southern states, and that the hungry farmers said they hated blacks, they hated Catholics, and they hated Jews, all who represented the very thing that were not part of what they saw as being true America. Quoting there, it is said that the Jews of Atlanta were blissfully ignorant of the ill will and animosity that hovered over them. At 11:30 to 12 o'clock in the morning of April the 26th, 1913, a 13-year-old girl, Mary Fagan, who worked for a pittance in a pencil factory, was involved in the manufacturing of pencils and the lead and the rubbers on the end of the pencil, which traditionally one has. She went to the National Pencil Company factory on a day where they weren't actually working, it was a holiday, to retrieve her paycheck. Leo Frank happened to be working on that day. He was conscientious, working, and he was sitting there working, and he saw this young girl come past him, and he gave her the paycheck. He, Leo, never saw Mary Fagan again, and she would never see Leo again. The following morning, Leo was picked up by the police and taken to the factory, and Leo admitted, yes, I saw Mary Fagan. And then he was taken to the factory and he was shown the body of Mary Fagan in the basement of the factory. And he was upset, concerned, and his upset and concern merely played into the thinking of the police that here we have somebody that is guilty of having murdered her. The police investigation was, in any way we can imagine, completely shoddy. There was no attempt to isolate the crime, to isolate the area where she was murdered, to isolate anything to do with it. People were wandering over it. The crime scene was treated badly. They misidentified blood. The evidence was lost and destroyed, and notes which were found implicating the Negro who worked there somehow became implicated in a different way. 40 newspapers. Now we begin to get what the media can do in the world then as it does now. 40 newspapers with special editions reported on the foul-blooded, cold-blooded murder of Mary Fegan, this young little girl, and they demanded justice. And those involved in the justice system needed a result and needed a guilty party because they were standing for office, and they couldn't have it in Atlanta, which was one of the centers of crime at that time. They couldn't have yet another occasion when somebody would not be found guilty, as it were. Leo Frank, told the police everything he knew. There was no evidence, none whatsoever, that contradicted his evidence. But by giving evidence, the police fed into what they already believed and decided that he was somehow guilty because he knew the detail too much. There was now Frank, who decided at that point to contract a lawyer. And he contacted a lawyer, and the press saw that as another admission of guilt. Why does he need a lawyer if he's innocent? But he's a Jew, they've got money, they're influential, he's going to have and this merely makes him more guilty. Now there was a campaign of hate, and much against the Jews and Judaism, and Leo Frank became the primary suspect of a murder he never did. Yet Jim Colney, the janitor, and the real murderer, who was also held but the prosecutor wanted a conviction for Frank, eventually released Colney. Colney was a black Negro who was undoubtedly guilty of the murder, but he was not the person that the press, the police, the politicians wanted to be guilty. On July the 28th, the date of the trial, the newspaper printed vile bits of unsubstantiated information. The yelled headline was, "Police have the Strangler." July the 28th, 1913, Leo Frank is put on trial. Prosecution states, "We found stains in the opposite room where Leo Frank worked, and they were the stains of the blood of Mary Fegan. They found hair," they said, "in the office of Leo Frank, which was from Mary Fegan." Both were untrue. The blood was not blood. The blood was stain from metal. And the hair was, in fact, a sliver from a broom which was used in that room. Then they found notes at the scene about the murder, that he committed the murder, which they claimed was written by Leo. But the language wasn't of a man like Leo, was the language of somebody who was not so educated. But they claimed, the prosecution, that such language and such ability to write something like that is impossible for a Negro. A Negro can't write something which would make sense, would write something which was clear and had clarity to it. Therefore, being a Negro, he couldn't have made up the story, and that was another accusation against Leo. So it had to be true. The defense came forward. They believed they had every argument possible to defend Leo because, well, he didn't do it. And a boy, Alonzo Mann, knew the truth because he'd seen what'd been going on, but he wasn't pressured to tell the truth, in fact, quite the opposite. And when he went home, he was threatened by his own mother that don't say a word. And he was told that if he told the truth about the Jew, he would be hanged. The closing arguments came. Frank, said the media, said the police, said the prosecution, said even the judge at the time, is nothing but a miserable Jew. This is in Atlanta, in America, in the land of the free. Prosecution spoke for 3 whole days about this cold-blooded murder. It was described in many places as the Dreyfus of Atlanta. The trial lasted for 29 days. It was a classic example of trial by media, newspapers by the masses, by the anti-Semites, and he was found guilty. Shouts then went out, hang the Jew, and there were threats of lynching. Anti-Semitism was virulent, and the Jews of Atlanta lived in fear and closed their doors and waited for the awfulness, as it were, to disappear. There was then appeals. There was an appeal to the Georgia Supreme Court, but it failed by a majority vote. Leo Frank was still found guilty, and his execution date was announced. While Coley, the actual murderer, was also tried in court as an accessory to murder in some way or another, and he was held in prison but released after just 10 months. And he lived to a drunken age quite well, actually. There was another appeal, which went to the US Supreme Court. And again, this appeal was denied, and a 4th date was set now for execution, another date. There were a total of 13 appeals, which were all denied. 100,000 letters were written asking for clemency, and he was visited on frequent occasions by the Rabbi Geffen, who had become famed for Coca-Cola and was a new rabbi there in Atlanta. And he was visited on many occasions to give him hope and faith that all would be well. Even the judge, who had then spoke out, who had sentenced Leo Frank to death, wrote appealing that Leo was innocent and he should not die, for Conley, the Negro, was without question guilty of the murder. Governor Slayton, who was the governor at the time, appealed on behalf of Leo. As a result of actually coming out on the side of Leo Frank, he had to flee Atlanta. He lost his job and he was never able to attain any position in Atlanta again. His wife said, "I would rather be the widow of a brave and honorable man than the wife of a coward." And soon later, Governor Slayton then commuted Leo's death sentence to life imprisonment. The reaction from the nascent and developing something known as the Ku Klux Klan raged, and they spoke then of lynching. They were vicious in their approach, and the anti-Semitism grew with no stopping in Atlanta. Can you mute yourself? Georgia's traitorous governor has sold his soul, they said, for Jewish gold. Leo Frank, therefore, they decided to move out of the prison, which was a bit too local in Atlanta, to move him to a new, safer prison. There, one evening, he was attacked by a fellow inmate, and but for the action of the staff and medical people, he would have bled to death. But he survived the assault, and he continued there to live in the new, safer prison. On August the 16th, 1915, that is some 2 years after the original accusation of his murdering of Mary Fagan, he, in his cell, was there when 25 men, we know every one of them, we have pictures of every one of them, they all had their photographs taken. Many of them were well known and important, mayors, leaders of the Atlanta community. They drove to the prison where Leo Frank was kept. They cut the telephone wires so that the prison authorities wouldn't be able to contact anybody else. They walked into the prison and the prison guards literally opened the prison up. There was never a gun fired. There was no resistance of the 25 men who came in, and it was total and absolute state complicity. And they took Frank from his cell. They didn't do anything there. They took Leo, Frank, the innocent party, in the cars, which they then drove 175 miles to the town where Mary Fagan had lived. All the while, they asked him, confess, confess. He never, Leo Frank, never confessed. And he declared his innocence, which merely riled them even more. At that point, they shackled his ankles together, and they strung him up from a tree, and he was lynched. The word lynching, of course, not of course, but the word lynching is named after Charles Lynch, who was involved in the lynching. That's the origin of the word, is somebody's name. And his body was left hanging overnight, all night long. In the morning, when one person found the body hanging, which wasn't that unusual in that part of the world, because lynching went on invariably of Negroes, rarely, if ever, of white people, but thousands knew who he was, and thousands came to view his body. None of the lynchers, as I said, you can see photographs today, none of the lynchers hid their faces from the camera. None of them were ever prosecuted for what went on. Across the country of America, even in the Southern America, there was absolute revulsion, noting, and it wouldn't be long before lynching would be banned by law, that recklessness in the media can lead to the murder of an innocent man, said the press. And this is exactly what it was. If you build up a whole murderous intent and your media goes on and on and on about the guilt of a person, people see him as guilty. Jews at that time actually fled from the state of Georgia, and the community, those remaining, felt very uneasy. The aftermath is interesting. He was a Jew, and it's only because he was a Jew, was lynched for a crime he did not commit in an area where he lived peacefully with a peaceful family, and many people who should have known better somehow were implicated in the lynching. Aftermath saw a growth in the Ku Klux Klan. There was now the formation in America as a result by the Anti-Defamation League. That's when they grew and established themselves in order to be able to fight anti-Semitism. It took 70 years. 800 editorials around the country condemned the state of Georgia for denying Frank a pardon. Give him a pardon, they said. And this is 70 years after the event. We're now talking well into the 1920s. 1985. In 1986, Frank finally received a pardon for negligence of the state for failing to protect him in the prison, that they allowed others to grab him from the prison. It did not exonerate him from the crime. It did not exonerate him from the crime of murder. It merely gave him a pardon for the negligence that the prison guards had failed to protect him in the prison where he was. In 1995, and there is today if you go to Atlanta, there is a plaque and other things there, was placed on the building where the lynching took place, and it states on the plaque, he was, quote, wrongly accused, falsely convicted, and wantonly murdered. And at that point, in 1995, over 80 years, around 80 years since the crime of having lynched him, Kaddish was said by the place of where the tree of the lynching took place. And that was the Leo Frank affair and the Coca-Cola affair of Atlanta in the 20th century. And with that hot And day, I leave you all to have a joyous Thursday, a wonderful day, and I look forward to seeing you very soon. Have a good day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.